Can I believe you when you say you killed your mother?
Yes, I did do it. You know, I mean, I don't know positively I did, but I'm pretty sure I did.
How many murders have you confessed to?
Over 3,000.
3,000?
Yeah, over 3,000.
You spent a lot of time confessing.
2.5 years.
Today's case will deal with a couple who terrorized some cities in the United States for years. They kidnapped and killed. They even committed acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. The pair confessed to hundreds of crimes and became known as two of the worst, most notorious serial killers in America. This is the story of the serial killers, Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia, United States. He was the youngest of 9 siblings. They were very poor and lived in a small shack. His father, Anderson Lucas, was an alcoholic and worked on a railroad. He lost a leg after being involved in a train accident. His mother, Viola Lucas, was a prostitute who had a cruel and violent personality. She forced her children to watch her while she had sex with her clients. She also frequently brutally attacked her children. Once, Henry spent 3 days in a coma due to a violent beating his mother gave him. On another occasion, at the age of 10, Henry had one of his eyes seriously injured during a fight with one of his brothers. As his mother did not provide proper medical care, the eye became irreversibly infected and had to be removed. Henry has worn a glass eye since then. The cruelties she subjected her children to were unbelievable. She seemed to enjoy humiliating her son. Out of sheer whim or spite, she sometimes forced Henry to go to school dressed in girls' clothes. In childhood and adolescence, Henry displayed behavior described as immoral and frightening. At the age of 13, he had sexual relations with his older brother, and also with animals. For fun, he stabbed small animals to death. At 14 years of age, Henry dropped out of school and ran away from home. He wandered through different cities in the state of Virginia and committed small thefts in order to support himself. 1951 was the year in which his criminal practices reached a much more serious level. Aged just 15 years old, Henry committed his first murder, asphyxiating a 17-year-old girl who had refused to have sex with him. In 1954, at the age of 18, Henry was arrested and convicted for the first time on charges of more than a dozen thefts and robberies around Richmond, Virginia. He served his sentence and was released from prison 5 years later, in 1959, when he moved to the state of Michigan, where he went to live with one of his sisters. In January 1960, Henry's mother traveled to Michigan to visit them. Henry said he would take up residence there and try to make a living. The mother did not agree because she wanted Henry to return with her to Virginia so that he could take care of her during her old age. When Henry refused to return to his mother's house, she became enraged and began violently attacking him with a broomstick. Henry reacted and stabbed her in the neck. After murdering his mother, Henry fled, but was found a short time later in Ohio. Henry tried to claim that he had reacted to his mother's attack in self-defense, that he had suffered a type of mental block at the time of the fight, and for this reason, he did not remember the details of the event. This argument did not convince the police and judicial authorities, and at the age of 23, Henry was arrested for the second time, just a year after leaving prison. 10 years later, in 1970, Henry was released from the prison system again. Without a family or fixed residence, he spent the following years traveling through various cities in the United States. He carried out small jobs, used government assistance programs, and as usual, from time to time he also committed theft. In 1976, on one of his trips across the country, Henry met a person with a background very similar to his own, and who would become a central figure in his life, Ottis Toole. Ottis Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. His childhood was equally marked by physical and emotional abuse and extreme poverty in a dysfunctional family. His father was an alcoholic and abandoned his mother and 4 brothers when he was still a child. His mother was a religious fanatic who applied severe physical and moral punishments to her children when they misbehaved, but completely neglected what was happening around them. As a child, Ottis was sexually abused by neighbors and several family members. He said that he was first sexually abused at the age of 6, when a friend of his father forced him to sexually caress her. Ottis's mother sometimes dressed him in girls' clothes and called him Susan without any explanation. His maternal grandmother was a Satanist and initiated young Ottis into satanic practices and rituals, which included grave robbing in cemeteries and self-mutilation. These acts became known to the neighbors, who were very frightened by Ottis's bizarre behavior, and mainly by the ominous nickname that his grandmother had bestowed upon him, Son of the Devil. Ottis lived in a harsh reality full of limitations. He had a very low intellectual level and was diagnosed with mental retardation. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and could barely read, write, or express himself clearly. He was also epileptic and suffered from several fits throughout his life. He ran away from home several times in his childhood and youth and took shelter in abandoned houses or prostituted himself in exchange for overnight stays. But by the age of 14, he took prostitution more seriously. Furthermore, Ottis had developed a certain fascination with fire and would set things on fire for pure pleasure. It was also at the age of 14 that he claimed to have committed his first murder. After having a disagreement with a street vendor who had approached him to have sex, Ottis used the man's own car to run him over and then flee. The first time Ottis was taken to reformatory prison was in 1964 at the age of 17 for vagrancy and begging. He was released shortly afterwards, and for the next few years he continued his nomadic life around his hometown, prostituting himself and committing petty crimes. The paths of Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole then crossed in 1976 in the city of Jacksonville, where Ottis lived. Henry was passing through the town and the two met at a gay bar. The affinity between them was instant. They identified with each other, shared the similarities in their life stories, and bragged about the crimes they had committed. They became very good friends, but some say that they were, in fact, lovers. Henry then decided to stop wandering from city to city and settle in Jacksonville. They both got jobs at a small local company. They were good employees overall, but unstable. Sometimes they didn't show up for work. They would disappear for a few days and then return happy, in a good mood, and with some extra money. To everyone's surprise, in 1977, Ottis, at the age of 30, an open homosexual, married a woman 24 years older. The marriage, however, would not last more than a year. His ex-wife stated that when Ottis was nervous, he could only calm down if he hurt someone or set something on fire. Between 1979 and 1981, Henry and Ottis travelled across the country with no known destination. It is not possible to say whether they were together the whole time or whether they went their separate ways. Ottis's mother passed away in May 1981, and he returned to Jacksonville for the funeral. Shortly thereafter, Ottis's sister, who was a drug addict, committed suicide, leaving a 13-year-old daughter named Becky, who was placed in foster care. These events further shook Otis's already troubled personality. He was constantly drunk or drugged. He spent nights in the cemetery, lying on his mother's grave, and talked about crimes he had committed and ones he planned to commit. A few months later, Henry returned to Jacksonville and was reunited with Otis. The two decided to leave the city and return to their old life of wandering along the country's roads. But this time, they would have another companion, Becky, Otis's 13-year-old niece. They rescued her from the orphanage and continued their journey. Before long, Becky, an orphaned teenager, full of emotional problems, became sexually involved with Henry, a man 32 years older than her, who in turn seemed to be, for the first time in his life, truly in love. He wanted to have Becky as his girlfriend. The trio continued their adventure across the country without a specific destination for almost 2 years, until suddenly Becky and Henry decided to separate from Otis. The couple headed to Texas, while Otis returned to Florida. He stopped in a few different cities along the way, always very upset and lamenting the betrayal he had suffered from his friend and niece. In 1982, in Stoneburg, Texas, Henry got a job as a handyman in the home of an 80-year-old woman named Kate Rich. Kate's children hired Henry to renovate the house and allowed Henry and Becky to stay in a small house at the back of the property. Due to the age difference, Henry said that Becky was his daughter. Henry started working on the renovation. Becky kept Mrs. Kate company and helped her with household chores. Kate became very attached to Becky, whom she treated like a daughter. Becky eventually told Henry that she was unhappy and wanted to return to Florida, but Henry didn't agree. It turns out that time was passing and the house renovation work was not progressing. Kate's children suspected that Henry was scamming them, taking money from them without doing the job he was hired to do. They freely used the lady's credit card, not only to buy materials for work on the house, but also for drinks and cigarettes. Kate's children eventually evicted them. Without work or housing, the couple was sheltered by a local religious community called House of Prayer. There, they occupied an abandoned chicken coop as their home. Meanwhile, Becky insisted on returning to Florida, and the fights between the couple became more frequent and violent. Until, one day, the couple left the House of Prayer, saying they would travel back to Florida. Days later, Henry returned to the religious community alone, claiming that Becky had abandoned him. About a month passed, and Henry remained in that area, doing small jobs and receiving help from the community. Until shocking news shook the small town of Stoneburg. Mrs. Kate Rich was missing. The local police carried out searches and investigations, but the only thing they found was her bag left on the side of a road. Henry was soon considered the main suspect, since, according to the statements obtained, he would have been the last person Kate had contact with. Henry had left the House of Prayer the day before, saying he was going to Kate's house. Since then, the lady had not been seen again. Henry claimed he had given Kate a ride to the church, left her there, and then left. The police were convinced of Henry's involvement, but searches and interrogations yielded no evidence linking him to the case. The lady's body was not found. During the investigation, the police discovered that, in addition to her, there were other women missing in Stoneburg and surrounding areas. They also discovered that Becky had disappeared, although Henry claimed that she had simply abandoned him and left for Florida alone. The year was 1983, and 9 months had passed. Investigators were frustrated that they were unable to obtain a confession or physical evidence that would incriminate Henry. It was then that the local police tried a new approach. They discovered that Henry had a firearm and arrested him on charges of illegal possession. When taken to the police station, Henry said, "In Texas, when they don't get you one way, they get you another. Right, Sheriff. I was going to help you find Kate, but now I won't." Henry refused to cooperate and was detained at the police station for 3 days. As reported, he was kept alone in a cell in very unsanitary conditions, without water or food. He eventually agreed to talk, and what Henry had to say was frightening. He revealed that not only had he killed Kate, but he had also dismembered her entire body, burned the pieces, and buried the remains in the shelter's backyard. The police followed his instructions and found Kate's remains. Regarding the motivation for the crime, Henry revealed, "I was with her in the car and I felt like having sex, so I took a detour on the road, killed her, and had sex with her body." The police officers were shocked by this brutal and cold account of what had happened. But Henry had more terrible revelations to make. He said Becky wanted to go back to Florida, but he wanted to stay there. They fought a lot about it. Then she got angry and said she was leaving alone. Henry was never going to let that happen. He had to go with her. So they hit the road. That night they drank a lot, and then he said he wasn't going to Florida at all. She got very angry, screamed and hit him. He lost control, took a knife and stuck it in her chest. He hadn't intended on doing that, it just happened like a reflex. Unlike the testimony about Mrs. Kate's murder, this time Henry seemed a little emotional as he recalled the harm he did to his girlfriend. When asked why he killed her and what he did after killing her, the answer was shocking. He reported in a very sad way but in cruel detail that after stabbing Becky, he dismembered her entire body, wrapped the parts in pillowcases and scattered them in a forest next the highway. The police went to the place he indicated, and there they found everything, as he had described. On June 21, 1983, Henry was brought to justice for the murders of Kate Rich and Becky Powell. To everyone's astonishment, at that hearing, he declared that he had killed dozens of other women in recent years. He said he used to kill for the same reason, to have sex with the bodies. He said this had become part of his life, having sex with dead people. News agencies across the country reprinted Henry's statement, attracting widespread media and public attention. From then on, he would confess to one murder after another, which would have been committed in several states across the country during his travels on the North American highways. At that time, throughout the country, there were a large number of unsolved homicides. Henry's statement aroused the interest of police authorities from different jurisdictions, who began asking to interview him, hoping to solve pending cases. In his statements, Henry gave very specific descriptions of the crimes he allegedly committed, indicating precise locations, drawing the victims' faces, describing very consistent details. All the information he presented was compatible with the data the police had on the cases. The police were very impressed and believed he was telling the truth. Henry's contribution to solving the cases was very valuable to the police, and to keep him talking, the authorities tried to keep him satisfied. In his cell, he had colour TV, cable TV, unlimited coffee, and as many packs of cigarettes as he wanted. The demand for Henry was so great that it was necessary to create an exclusive task force to coordinate his testimonies. He began travelling the country with police authorities to close cases. He was always treated with perks. He stayed in comfortable hotels and ate gourmet meals. He was even taken to California on a private plane to identify crime scenes. The more crimes he confessed to, the more benefits he received. Once, when making one of his confessions, Henry added a special detail to the case. His faithful friend, Ottis Toole, had been an accomplice to a certain crime and to some others that he would later confess to. Henry and Ottis's criminal partnership reportedly lasted many years, during which they travelled the country and collected victims along the way. Henry reported that they had no discretion in choosing who to kill or how to kill. He stated that both were necrophiles, that is, they had sex with the corpses of their victims. Henry spoke with some pride about the varied methods he and his partner in crime used. There were shootings, stabbings, beatings, crucifixions. Some were burned. For him, it's impossible that anyone else in the country could have done everything that they did. Henry said he decided to distance himself from Ottis when he began exhibiting even more bizarre behaviour. According to him, Ottis began participating in a satanic cult that practiced cannibalism, which is a bit ironic because stealing, killing and sexually abusing was acceptable for Henry, but cannibalism was too much. He said, "The problem was when he started eating people. I walked away. It got to the point where he would cut a piece out of almost every victim and eat it. I could not." But where was Ottis Toole? He had been arrested recently, in June 1983, on charges of setting 2 houses on fire in Jacksonville. After his arrest, he voluntarily confessed to starting more than 40 fires over the past 2 decades. For these crimes, Ottis was sentenced to 20 years in prison. When questioned about the criminal partnership with Henry, Ottis confirmed all of his former friend's statements. He admitted to having participated in more than 100 homicides with Henry, in 11 different states. Furthermore, he decided to confess to his own murders, also attracting Henry's attention. Ottis said that, after separating from Henry and Becky, he wandered the country for almost a year. During that time, he said he murdered 9 people in 6 different states. He claimed responsibility for barbaric crimes that became famous and had not been solved, such as the kidnapping and murder of a 6-year-old boy, Adam Walsh, whose body and decapitated head were found in a river channel in Hollywood. In addition to the sentence he was already serving, Ottis was indicted for other crimes. At the end of his trials, which earned him several years in prison, the most severe sentences were for a fire in Jacksonville that resulted in a fatality and a murder of a 19-year-old girl. For these crimes, he was sentenced to the death penalty, but both convictions were later converted to life imprisonment upon appeal. In total, Henry and Ottis's confessions helped police close more than 200 murder cases, and everything they said obviously generated a lot of commotion and general interest. The media fed on the macabre reports of Henry and Ottis, and they came to be referred to as the duo from hell. The two became criminal celebrities and seemed to enjoy the fame and attention they received. After a certain point, they seemed to have lost track of reality and began to make absurd statements. They said they killed Jimmy Hoffa, the biggest union leader in the US, who was missing at the time. They even went so far as to say that they had committed a murder in Japan. Henry and Ottis were now crossing the line, losing credibility and raising suspicions. At that point, Henry had already been sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Kate and Becky and was about to be indicted and convicted of several other murders. But there was one specific case that would become a turning point in this story. Henry had confessed to being responsible for a high-profile crime, known as the case of the orange socks. The crime had occurred 4 years earlier. The naked body of a girl was found in the sewer of the city of Georgetown, Texas. She was only wearing a pair of orange socks. The girl was sexually assaulted before being murdered by strangulation. There was no physical evidence or witnesses in this case. Therefore, Henry's confession was the only piece of evidence available and would be sufficient to indict him. It turns out that, due to the aggravating circumstances of the case according to the laws of the state of Texas, Henry could be sentenced to the death penalty. In the meantime, police authorities were beginning to become suspicious of Henry and Otis's excessive confessions. In a few cases, it was possible to easily confirm the guilt of one, the other, or both. But in the vast majority of crimes they confessed to, there were pieces that didn't fit together, contradictions between one person's testimony and the other, and specific details that they were unaware of. It was becoming increasingly evident that, by counting on the cooperation of the two criminals, the police were only closing cases, not solving homicides. It was then that some well-meaning police officers began testing Henry's confessions. They presented him with several fictitious cases, and in the vast majority of cases, they obtained their confessions. In other words, Henry was taking the blame for all homicides that were being presented. Henry's own lawyers no longer believed the confessions he made. They then began to look for evidence that would prove that he could not be the perpetrator of several of the crimes he had confessed to. They placed detectives to verify Henry's location on key dates and then compare this information with the timelines of the cases. Through records of dates of medical and dental care, attendance at social assistance centres to withdraw government benefits, in addition to other specific dates, several of Henry's confessions could be invalidated. For his lawyers, it was proven. Henry was dedicating himself to confessing to crimes he had not committed. His lawyers then confronted him, stating that they already had proof that he could not have committed several of the crimes he confessed to. Henry gave a big smile and said, "I was wondering how long it would take for you to realize this." From there, he began to explain how he had managed to deceive so many people. Proudly, he said that it was easy to convince anyone. Just tell them what they wanted to hear. Despite not being educated, Henry was a shrewd and clever man. During the testimonies, he subtly fished for small pieces of information from the police officers and built a story from there. He added to his statement details that the police themselves had provided him with, and that was enough for confirmation. Meanwhile, he was being tried in court as a defendant in the Orange Socks case. Henry was found guilty of sexual abuse and aggravated murder and sentenced to the death penalty. However, his lawyers were convinced that he was innocent in this case. And when faced with the real possibility of losing his life, Henry regretted his confession and wanted to appeal. But perhaps it was too late. Henry was sent to death row in 1985. His lawyers gathered all the evidence they could obtain that invalidated Henry's confessions, including in the case of the Orange Socks to appeal the death penalty. Over the next decade, the effort of Henry's defense team was tremendous. Several of his confessions were discarded, and many of the cases were not even tried. But Henry was still listed as the perpetrator of many other crimes. The main one still had him on death row. All appeals were denied, and time was running out. It was then that a document was made public. Henry's lawyers presented the Henry Lucas Report, a compilation of evidence that dismantled hundreds of confessions made by him. The document highlighted that there was no physical evidence linking Henry to the crimes for which he was accused, including in the case of the Orange Socks. Furthermore, with the exception of the cases of Kate Rich and Becky Powell, Henry had never led investigators to discover new bones, new locations, or new pieces of evidence. Henry's confessions merely replicated the data the police already had. The Lucas report was very robust and caused much concern because, with Henry actually being innocent of these various crimes, the real killers were on the loose. The report guaranteed survival, extra time for Henry, but he was still waiting on death row for his execution date. On September 15th, 1996, Ottis Toole died in prison, suffering from severe liver cirrhosis. In 1998, the US Supreme Court rejected Henry's last appeal in the Orange Socks case. The execution date was set, and on death row, Henry gave an interview to the CBS network in which he made surprising revelations.
Can I believe you when you say you killed your mother?
Yes, I did do it. I don't know positively I did, but I'm pretty sure I did.
How many murders have you confessed to?
Over 3,000.
3,000?
Yeah, over 3,000.
You spent a lot of time confessing.
2.5 years.
3,000 murders.
7 days a week.
Henry stated that he made his first confessions, the murders of Kate and his girlfriend Becky, after receiving very rough treatment at the police station, but that the police said he would receive greater comfort and cordiality if he confessed to the crimes. For this reason, 3 days later, he admitted guilt for those murders. From then on, it was clear that the more crimes he confessed to, the more benefits he obtained. Henry was rarely handcuffed, walked freely around the police station, and received coffee, snacks, and cigarettes whenever he asked. To do this, all he had to do was read the police reports presented to him and repeat the information exactly, taking the blame for the crimes. Henry's last resort was to ask for clemency. George W. Bush was governor of Texas in 1998 and had never pardoned anyone on death row. But with the support of influential legal scholars and based on the reasonable doubts raised by the Henry Lucas report, Bush authorized the death sentence to be converted to life in prison. Henry served his sentence until March 12, 2001, when he died at the age of 65 due to natural causes. The story of Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole arouses much interest and controversy to this day. Issues such as the role of the media, which often elevates criminals to celebrity status, the role of the police, which is often more concerned with numbers and performance indicators than with the actual resolution of crimes, the role of the judicial system, which often reacts slowly and inefficiently. All of these topics generated heated and important debates for society. This context, however, in no way mitigates the fact that Henry and Ottis were proven cruel murderers who deserved to be punished for their heinous crimes. It will never be known how many crimes they really committed, nor how many murderers remained free and unpunished because of their lying confessions. The truth is that they both had the mentality of serial killers. They took morbid pleasure in killing and never showed an ounce of remorse, guilt, or regret.